October 1846, St. Mary Parish, Louisiana. The rice fields are still wet from the last pull of summer storms, the canals running like veins cut into the land, and the Beauregard plantation is doing what plantations always do best, pretending stability is virtue. But stability is just another word the powerful use when they don't want you to look too closely. Because on the first Friday of October, October 9th, 1846, Isaac Beauregard, the patriarch, the man whose name sits on every deed and every debt note, dies abruptly inside his own sugarhouse office, a room that smells of ink, molasses, and the quiet confidence of ownership. No long illness, no warning. One moment he's dictating figures, the next he's on the floor, jaws slack, eyes open, as if even in death he refuses to admit surprise. They say, apoplexy. They say, God's will. They always say something that keeps the conversation clean. But the timing is not clean. The timing is a blade. Because when a master dies suddenly, the plantation doesn't pause. It recalculates. And the first thing it recalculates is not grief. It's possession. By dusk, the house is full of whispering relatives and men in coats too fine for field mud, law clerks, creditors, neighbors who call themselves friends, curtains drawn, voices low. A funeral can wait, the estate cannot. And in that house, moving silently between rooms she has served since childhood, is Diana Carter. 36 years old, enslaved, a house servant all her life, which is a polite way of saying she has lived her entire existence inside other people's walls, breathing other people's rules, raising other people's children, while her own daughter learns early what it means to be seen as an asset. Diana's daughter is Lila, 13, thin from work and watchfulness, old enough to understand that every adult smile in this house can hide a decision that breaks her life in half. On paper, Isaac Beauregard is dead. But on the plantation, Isaac's hand keeps moving, through documents, through clauses, through the way other men invoke his wishes, only when convenient. That is the first lie this story exposes. Death does not end power. It redistributes it, and redistribution is where the violence hides, not in whipping posts and bloodied backs, but in parlors and offices where people speak softly and sign loudly. There's a locked desk in Isaac's office. Heavy oak, brass keyhole polished by years of use. The key doesn't go to the widow. It doesn't go to Diana, who has cleaned that office for decades and knows which drawer sticks in humid months. The key goes, as keys usually do, to the men who believe they were born to turn them. By the morning after Isaac's death, October 10th, Uncle Silas Beauregard is already hovering near the desk like a vulture with a legal vocabulary. 52, not the heir by bloodline, not the owner by title yet, but in practice he is already acting as executor, the loudest voice in the room, the one who knows how to make family duty sound like a threat. He tells the widow not to strain herself. He tells the younger men to be sensible. He tells the servants to stay out of the way. And when he opens that desk, he does it like a man checking the condition of a weapon. Inside, among notes and canal maps and debt schedules, there is a sealed memorandum, not a poem, not a confession, a document, because men like Isaac Beauregard don't express mercy in speech. They express it in ink, if they express it at all. Dated September 21st, 1846, less than 3 weeks before he died. A freedom clause. Specific language. Names written plainly. Diana Carter and her daughter Lila. Manumission to be granted. Not at some vague future, not when convenient, but as a declared wish tied to the estate. A promise embedded in the machinery. This is where the room changes. You can feel it, not because anyone shouts. They don't. They are too practiced for that. The air changes because the Beauregards suddenly see a problem they can't whip away. If Diana is freed, she stops being inventory. If Lila is freed, she stops being leverage. If Isaac's clause stands, it establishes something dangerous, that even a patriarch's authority can be used against his heirs. And heirs do not forgive documents that limit them. They call it complicated. They call it improper. They say Isaac wasn't himself. Notice the pattern. The moment a written promise threatens their advantage, the dead man becomes unreliable. They will praise Isaac's wisdom when it protects the land, but question his mind when it protects a black woman and her child. That is not confusion. That is strategy. Silas frames it first. The clause is sentiment, the product of an aging man being influenced by religion, by guilt, by who knows what. He wants it treated as a footnote, a man's last whim, And around him, others nod because nodding is cheaper than conscience. There are creditors in the room too, men who don't care about bloodlines, only balances. They see the plantation as numbers. If Diana and Lila are freed, the estate loses value. If they remain enslaved, they remain collateral. Do you understand what that means? A mother and child are being weighed against canal repairs and seed loans, and the scales don't wobble with shame. They settle. Meanwhile, Diana is still pouring water, carrying linens, clearing plates. She hears every sentence that matters because people speak as if enslaved ears are furniture, present, useful, incapable of testimony. That is the second lie this story exposes. They thought she didn't understand. Diana has spent her life learning to understand without reacting. That is what survival looks like when you are owned. You learn to read people faster than they read paper. By October 13, 1846, the estate meeting is formal. The parish lawyer arrives. The ledger books open like scripture. The family positions itself around the table like a jury that already knows its verdict. And in the middle of it all is Edmund Beauregard, the son, 26, the next of kin with the cleanest claim. The one the community expects to inherit. He's educated, polished, the kind of young man who can talk about duty and order without ever admitting what those words are built on. He looks at the clause and something in him tightens. Not compassion, not yet. When a man raised by power encounters a single sentence that demands he act like a human being instead of an heir, he can honor his father's written wish, or he can honor the appetite of the living. And the living are loud. Silas leans in with the family argument. If Edmund grants freedom, he sets precedent. Today it's Diana. Tomorrow it could be others. Today it's one clause. Tomorrow it could be the whole plantation questioned. Silas doesn't have to say the ugliest part out loud. Everyone in the room already knows it. If they let this promise stand, they admit that enslaved people are not permanent, and permanence is the foundation of their wealth. So they begin the real work, the work Hollywood rarely films because it looks like paperwork. They talk delays, they talk verification, they talk about whether Isaac properly filed the clause, whether witnesses were present, whether the language meets parish requirements. They talk about law as if law is neutral. But in 1846 Louisiana, law is not a shield, it is a weapon with a stamp. Diana hears the word delay and understands exactly what it means. Delay means time. Time means sale. Time means someone could move Lila to another property before the clause is ever honored. It means a mother could wake up one morning to find a child gone and be told it's temporary, necessary, for the estate. It means freedom can be strangled without ever openly denying it. And that is where the chapter ends. Not with a whip cracking, not with a scream, but with a sealed promise sitting on a table while men decide whether truth is enforceable. October 1846. A dead patriarch, a living feud. A mother and child standing in the doorway of liberation, watching the doorframe turn into a trap. Remember this clearly. The plantation did not need to beat Diana to endanger her. It only needed to doubt a document. In a society built on ownership, doubt is often the first act of cruelty. November 1846. The mourning cloth is still on the door and the plantation is already rewriting its own story. With claims, with lawyers, with family with claims, with lawyers, with family meetings that pretend to be about order while they are really about appetite. And in the center of it all stands Edmund Beauregard, 26 years old, newly crowned by death, told by everyone around him that he is now the master, as if mastery is a job title and not a moral deformity. Edmund is the heir in name, but not yet in control. The plantation is a machine with many hands, and the hands that have been turning it for decades do not surrender just because a young man inherits the key ring. Uncle Silas Beauregard, 52, executor in practice, predator in posture, knows this. Silas knows that new masters are easiest to steer in the first months before they learn the weight of their own signature. So Silas becomes Edmund's shadow, guiding him, flattering him, warning him, always warning him. The Freedom Clause becomes the test, dated September 21, 1846. Diana Carter and her daughter Lila named clearly, Manumission stated plainly, a dead father's written command. And still the family treats it like a stain that must be scrubbed out before the neighbors see. Because if the clause stands, it doesn't only free one woman and one child. It fractures the illusion that the Beauregards are unified, righteous, unquestionable. It tells the parish that even the patriarch knew, at the end, that something here was wrong enough to correct. And that kind of admission is contagious. So they pivot to the oldest method of cruelty among respectable families. They don't deny the promise outright. They question the man who made it. They do not say, "We refuse." They say, "We are not sure." In that difference between refusal and uncertainty, whole lives are destroyed. By November 6, 1846, Silas has arranged another estate conference in the main house. The local attorney, Jules Carpentier, sits with his papers and his careful neutrality, because neutrality is how men profit from other people's suffering. The widow speaks little. The younger cousins hover. Creditors sit close enough to smell the coffee. Edmund sits at the head of the table because tradition demands the performance, but the performance is thin. Everyone can see he is still learning how to wear authority without flinching. Silas begins with the language of duty. He does not shout. He does not threaten openly. He says, "The estate is fragile. The canals require repairs before spring. Rice seed must be purchased. Labor must be managed. Debt notes are coming due in January 1847. He frames it like stewardship, but then he slides in the real message. Diana and Lila are assets. The clause, if acted upon immediately, reduces the estate's value and invites scrutiny. Those are the two gods of plantation morality, value and secrecy. Everything else is decoration. Edmund tries to speak like a man with a conscience, but he speaks like a man with a dilemma. He asks whether his father's written wishes are binding. He asks what the parish will say. He asks what the law requires. Notice what he does not ask, what Diana deserves. The conflict inside him is not centered on her humanity. It is centered on his risk. That is not heroism. That is the beginning stage of self-preservation waking up. Silas hears the weakness and presses it. He suggests Isaac was unwell in September. He suggests someone may have influenced him. He implies the clause could be challenged as the product of illness or undue persuasion. He does not name Diana out loud as the persuader. He doesn't have to. In their world, the idea of an enslaved woman exerting moral pressure is already treated like a crime. Silas takes that prejudice and turns it into a legal wedge. Then comes the more intimate cruelty. Silas makes Edmund feel childish. He tells him the parish expects firmness. He tells him the family expects loyalty. He tells him quietly that a master who lets servants dictate policy will be eaten alive. That sentence lands like a hook because Edmund already fears being perceived as weak. In this society, weakness is punished, and the easiest way for a young master to prove strength is to crush the one person who cannot fight back. Diana hears pieces of this through doors, through pauses in conversation, through the way Silas's voice drops when he says her name. She is still moving in the same house she has served for years, but now every hallway feels narrower because she understands the invisible truth. When an estate is contested, enslaved people become bargaining chips. A freedom clause does not protect her. It paints a target on her back. By mid-November, November 17, 1846, Silas has advanced to his next tactic, delay by procedure. He recommends verification of the clause. He insists they locate witnesses. He demands that the attorney confirm the parish filing standards. He suggests the clause be treated as a memo, rather than a formal manumission order. Each suggestion is a brick in a wall, and Edmund allows the wall to rise because allowing is easier than deciding. Here is where the indictment becomes plain. Edmund's conflict is real, but it is also convenient. Conflict gives him moral cover. It lets him tell himself he is not cruel, only uncertain. But in a system where uncertainty always benefits the oppressor, uncertainty is cruelty with clean hands. Every day Edmund fails to act is a day Diana remains property. Every day he hesitates is a day Silas gains leverage to do something irreversible. Silas understands irreversibility. He understands that the only thing more dangerous than an enslaved woman hearing a promise is an enslaved woman believing it. Belief turns into planning. Planning turns into networks. Networks turn into losses for the estate. So Silas starts watching Diana differently. He asks the kitchen staff questions. He notes who speaks to whom. He looks for any sign that the clause has spread beyond the family table, and he finds what he expected. Hope, not loud, not reckless, but present. And hope, in the eyes of men like Silas, is rebellion in its earliest form. Edmund tries to keep his distance from Diana as if distance can absolve him. He stops looking directly at her. He addresses instructions through overseers. When he does see her, His face tightens with something that could have been shame if he had the courage to name it. But he does not name it. He chooses the plantation's preferred emotion, discomfort without action, and then the estate's internal war becomes visible. On November 28, 1846, a creditor named Martin Duval arrives uninvited, carrying a note that reminds Edmund of debts owed by January. Duval makes no speech about family honor. He simply points at the ledger: land, canals, rice, and servants. He makes it clear that if the estate weakens, legal seizure is possible. In that moment, Edmund sees the plantation as a trap with teeth. If he displeases family, they sabotage him. If he displeases creditors, they strip him. And in both scenarios, the easiest sacrifice is the same: Diana and Lila. Not because they cause the danger, but because they are the most disposable. So Silas proposes an interim plan: keep Diana and Lila exactly where they are, under stricter supervision, until the clause is properly assessed. No talk of freedom, no movement beyond household duties, no special privileges. The phrasing is calm. The outcome is imprisonment by etiquette. Edmund nods. He tells himself it is temporary. Temporary is the word men use when they want to do harm without admitting permanence. December is approaching, and with it the winter sails, when human beings are moved like goods to settle accounts before the year ends. Diana knows this. She has heard the wagons at night before. She has seen families split for less than a clause, for less than a dispute, for less than a man's mood. She watches Lila more closely now, measuring every risk, every errand, every glance, every time Silas's eyes linger too long on the girl, as if he is calculating her value. And Edmund, new master, conflicted heir, begins to understand the real inheritance his father left him. It is not land. It is not canals. It is not a grand house. It is a choice wrapped in ink. Honor the dead man's written promise, or allow the living to bury it. His conflict is not personal drama. It is evidence. It shows how slavery maintained itself without constant spectacle, through families, through lawyers, through delays, through men who wanted to feel decent while remaining dominant. Remember this, because the record often forgets it on purpose. Diana is not at the mercy of one brutal villain with a whip. She is at the mercy of an entire apparatus that can smile while it tightens the net. November 1846 ends with the clause still on the table, still contested, still under review. That is what they call it when they are waiting for the moment to make freedom impossible. January 1847. While the Beauregard House argues over clauses and proper procedure, another machine is already moving, quiet, disciplined, and designed for survival. Not a tunnel, not a midnight dash through swamps, not the Hollywood fantasy where freedom arrives like a miracle. This is the other record, rarely filmed, often denied, where liberation is negotiated above ground, in plain sight, through letters, drafts, and receipts. The cruel joke is that the law that chains you can also be rented if you can pay its price. That is what they called order, but order in this case is just theft with paperwork. Diana Carter hears the word January and feels the weight behind it. January is when debts come due. January is when estates balance. January is when human beings disappear from kitchens and reappear on ledgers in other parishes. The Beauregards keep telling themselves they're waiting on legality, but Diana understands the true timeline. They're waiting for a moment to make the Freedom Clause useless. A promise that can't be executed in time becomes a promise that never mattered. That is how the powerful kill hope, by delaying it until it starves. What they don't see, because they never bother to look north unless it's to sell rice, is that Diana is not alone in time. She is not alone in memory. She is connected, by blood and by stubborn faith, to people who have spent years building a different kind of rescue, a rescue made of money, coded language, and the willingness of free black families to buy back the people the South treated as inventory. This is the above-ground underground railroad, the version that didn't need lantern signals because it traveled through post offices and banks, through the same public infrastructure that claimed to be civilized. Philadelphia, January 12, 1847. Ezekiel Carter, 38, free black carpenter, Diana's older brother, stands in a rented room above a small workshop on Lombard Street. His hands are scarred from chisels, not shackles, but he carries the same burden, the knowledge that his sister and niece are still trapped inside the Beauregard estate dispute. Ezekiel has lived with that ache for years, letters that never arrive, rumors that do, the helplessness of distance. But helplessness doesn't pay ransoms. So he does what free black communities were forced to become experts at. He turns grief into logistics. Ezekiel isn't alone either. He moves through church basements and mutual aid circles where names are spoken carefully and donations are folded into hymn books, where the hat passed around is not charity but strategy. People who have never met Diana still contribute because the system is predictable. If they don't save someone else today, no one will save them tomorrow. In the North, freedom has a different texture, papers, wages, mobility, but it is still haunted by the same truth. A black family is always one law away from disaster, so they act like family to strangers. That's the moral contrast the plantation never wants you to see. Boston, January 21st, 1847. Reverend Thomas Whitfield, 44, abolitionist minister with contacts that cross state lines, writes letters that never say what they mean. He writes shipment, account, repair, consultation. This is not melodrama. It is necessity. In a country where mail is watched and black mobility is criminalized, even compassion needs code. Whitfield's goal is simple: coordinate funds, identify a safe intermediary, and time the approach so it lands when the Beauregard estate is desperate enough to take money, but not so desperate that they decide to transfer Diana and Lila south and erase the problem. The window is narrow. The stakes are human. Here's what makes this movement so indicting. It exposes slavery's most obscene feature: its negotiability. The same family that calls Diana property will suddenly speak of her like a valuation. They will treat freedom as a price change. And the nation let them do it. That is not an accident of history. It is a confession written into commerce. Back in Louisiana, the Beauregard plantation becomes smaller without shrinking. February 1847 brings rain and paperwork. Silas tightens the household rules. Lila is kept closer to the main house. Fewer errands, fewer trips to the quarters. He says it's for her safety. In a plantation mouth, safety means control. Diana notices the new watchfulness, eyes following Lila, instructions delivered indirectly, the subtle violence of supervision that pretends it's care. Silas is not a man who whips in public. He is a man who relocates you on a ledger and calls it management. Edmund, for his part, is learning how to live with his own cowardice. He is now signing routine estate documents, seed purchases, canal work orders, debtor acknowledgments, and each signature is practice. He can sign for land without shaking. He can sign for debt without shame. But the Freedom Clause remains unsigned in the only way that matters: executed. He tells himself the attorney is still reviewing. He tells himself it will be done properly. He tells himself he is being responsible. But responsibility without courage is just delay wearing a clean shirt. The North's letters arrive in stages like a slow tide. March 1847. Funds begin to consolidate, not in one dramatic pile, but in small amounts. $5, $10, $20, collected from wages that were already thin. Each contribution is a sentence in an unspoken indictment. Free people paying to undo what the law refused to prevent. It is ransom, and the fact that it is necessary is the nation's moral bankruptcy made measurable. By April 1847, Whitfield and Ezekiel agree on an intermediary, someone who can move between worlds without drawing immediate suspicion. A Quaker merchant, Samuel Price, is identified later for the final approach, but before that, groundwork is laid, inquiries made through commercial channels, discussions framed as domestic hires or asset transfers, anything to avoid triggering Silas's instinct to sabotage. Because Silas is precisely the type who believes he owns not only bodies but outcomes. He does not just want Diana enslaved, he wants hope extinguished because hope is the one thing he cannot fully police. Diana does not see these letters. Argue louder. It often means money is argue louder. It often means money is tightening. And when money tightens, the plantation becomes more dangerous. That is why the above-ground underground railroad is not romantic. It is a race against administrative violence, against the quiet decision to sell a child to settle a note. May 1847. Ezekiel sends a final instruction through Whitfield. The offer must be clean, legal, irresistible, not a plea. A transaction. That is the bitter logic of this path. Freedom offered in the language the enslavers respect most. If the Beauregards will not honor a dead man's promise, they might honor cash. That is not justice, it is extraction. Of remembering becomes heavy. Because it of remembering becomes heavy. Because it forces you to admit something uncomfortable. Many enslaved people did not escape by running. They escaped by being purchased, sometimes by their own family, sometimes by allies, through a system that forced victims to finance their own liberation. The conventional story of slavery likes clear villains and visible brutality. This story is colder. It shows a world where a mother can be freed by a receipt, where a child's future can be negotiated like a canal repair, and where the most decisive battles happen in quiet rooms, across long distances, through paper that never bleeds but still wounds. By late May 1847, the funds are nearly ready. The message that will eventually land in Louisiana is being prepared. Carefully, discreetly, with all the caution of people who know the South punishes not only escape, but the very idea of it. The Beauregards do not know the net is forming around them. January to May 1847 passes like that. 1. January to May 1847 passes like that. One side delaying freedom through procedure, the other assembling freedom through sacrifice. And in the middle stands Diana, still serving meals, still lowering her eyes when spoken to, still carrying her daughter's fear like a second heartbeat. The plantation believes it owns time. But time is turning against it, not with riots or fires, but with envelopes sealed in northern rooms, with coins counted by hands that refuse to accept that blood can be permanently owned. Remember that. Because the record tried to hide it, the enslaved were not only victims of violence, they were targets of bureaucracy, and they fought back with the only weapons the system allowed them to hold: patience, networks, and the relentless, disciplined hope of escape. March 1847 doesn't announce itself with thunder. It arrives the way plantation violence often arrives, through routine, through a small administrative adjustment, through men who never raise their voices because they don't need to. By March 3, 1847, Uncle Silas Beauregard has decided the Freedom Clause is no longer merely a document to delay. It is a threat to neutralize. Delay was useful while he needed time to measure Edmund. Now he needs something stronger: relocation. Because a promise can't be honored if the promised people are moved out of reach. That is the ledger trick. Make the truth technically intact, then make it practically impossible. He chooses his moment carefully. Edmund is exhausted from creditors and canal bills, drained by the constant pressure of becoming a master overnight. Silas watches him like a handler watches a nervous animal, waiting for the day Edmund will accept anything that feels like solution. That day comes when a debt notice arrives dated March 1, 1847. Tight language, tight deadline. The estate must show stability. Silas translates stability into a familiar command. Secure the assets, reduce the risk, silence the complication. And to Silas, Diana and Lila are the complication. On March 6, 1847, in Isaac's old office, still smelling of ink and stale authority, Silas places a document in front of Edmund with the practiced calm of a man performing a minor chore. He calls it a temporary transfer. He says it's not a sale, not really. To a cousin by marriage, Caleb Hargrove. To a cousin by marriage, Caleb Hargrove, 40 years old, a mill operator whose property sits a few miles downriver, close enough to call it within the family, far enough to sever Diana from any leverage she has inside the Beauregard household, and most importantly, far enough to buy Silas time to bury the Freedom Clause under changed circumstances. Edmund reads the paper slowly. You can almost see his mind trying to build a loophole where he can remain decent without sacrificing power. He asks one weak question. Is this necessary? Silas answers with the kind of moral blackmail families specialize in. Necessary for the estate, necessary for your reputation, necessary to protect what your father built. Protect, built. The sacred words that always justify the unspeakable. Silas does not say, we are moving them so they can't be freed. He says, we are placing them where they will be properly supervised until this is settled. Supervised, another clean word for captivity. And Edmund, conflicted heir, polished young master, does what men like him often do when confronted with a choice that reveals their character. He hesitates long enough to feel the discomfort, then signs anyway, not with a flourish. With a controlled stroke. And with that stroke, he participates in a violence Hollywood rarely frames as violence, the violence of administrative separation. No blood, no screaming, just the sound of a pen ending a mother's fragile proximity to her own child's future. This is where the story's indictment sharpens. Edmund tells himself he has not harmed them because he has not struck them. But harm is not measured only in bruises. Harm is measured in how easily a life can be moved by someone else's convenience. Edmund's signature is not neutral. It is the mechanism by which Silas turns law into a net. By March 9, 1847, the plantation behaves as if the transfer is routine. Orders are issued as if they are housekeeping. Diana is told, indirectly, always indirectly, that she and Lila will be helping at the mill house for a time. Diana's face does not change because she has survived by controlling her face. But inside, she understands the sentence beneath the sentence. They are being repositioned as commodities. For a time is what enslavers say when they do not want to admit they are preparing permanence. Lila, 13, tries to be brave because children under coercion are forced to grow up too fast. But fear still leaks through in small, controlled ways. Silence where there used to be questions, hands going rigid when Diana straightens her collar, eyes flicking to doorways as if the house itself is listening. Diana holds her daughter's gaze and keeps her voice low because she knows how quickly ordinary words can be misheard, repeated, and used to justify harsher control. The plantation runs on surveillance. The walls don't hear by themselves, people do. And people, cornered by scarcity and intimidation, can be pressured into reporting what they shouldn't. Tells neighbors Edmund is handling matters responsibly. He frames the transfer as family consolidation, and this is why the record is so dangerous when read naively. It can make crimes look like management. Temporary transfer, domestic reassignment, operational necessity. These phrases are not descriptions. They are disguises. Caleb Hargrove's property is not an unknown. Diana has heard the name in murmurs for years, a man who runs labor hard, who values output, who speaks of discipline as if it's a religion. He is not a caricature of sadism. He doesn't need to be. The system doesn't require monsters, it requires compliance. What makes Caleb dangerous is that he will treat Diana and Lila not as household fixtures with history, but as units of work. And once a person becomes a unit, anything can be justified as efficiency. Edmund senses dimly that he has crossed a line. But instead of correcting it, he retreats into paperwork again, because paperwork is where he feels powerful without feeling guilty. He tells himself the clause can still be honored later. Later, the most lethal word in this entire story. Later is how promises are killed without a murder scene. Later is how a father's last wish becomes a footnote. Later is how a young master convinces himself he is not a villain, only a man waiting for the right moment. But the right moment never arrives by accident. It must be chosen, and Edmund refuses to choose it. By March 15, 1847, Diana and Lila are settled into the Hargrove household, and the separation begins doing its intended work. Diana is placed back into domestic tasks, but under stricter control. Lila is pulled toward labor that keeps her visible, accountable, exhaustible. The point is not merely to extract work. The point is to remind them they are movable, that their lives are contingent. That any hope attached to the Beauregard Freedom Clause is now a distant rumor. And here is the prosecutorial detail that matters. Silas has not destroyed the clause. He doesn't need to. He only needs to create conditions where enforcing it becomes complicated, disputed, inadvisable. If anyone in the parish asks later, he can shrug and say, "We intended to comply, but circumstances changed." Circumstances meaning we moved the people and made compliance inconvenient. Circumstances meaning we did what power does when it fears accountability. Diana, meanwhile, begins to understand the full geometry of the trap. The move is not only about work, it is about isolating her from potential allies inside the Beauregard sphere. It is about making her easier to sell if the ransom rumors reach Silas. It is about ensuring that if Northern money arrives, it arrives to an estate that can claim, those individuals are no longer under our direct control. A technicality. A lie with a legal spine. This is why you must remember this chapter as a moral lesson, not a plot point. Slavery did not survive for centuries only because it used overt brutality. It survived because it perfected bureaucracy. Because men like Silas could ruin lives with a calm tone and a document header. Because men like Edmund could become accomplices while still believing they were conflicted, decent, almost kind. History is full of Edmunds, people who would never call themselves cruel, yet signed cruelty into existence. March 1847 ends with Diana and Lila displaced, the clause still unexecuted, and Edmund still pretending he has time. But time is not on Diana's side. It never has been. And now, with one signature, it is running even faster, toward sale, toward separation, toward the kind of disappearance that leaves no blood on the floor, only emptiness in a mother's hands. June 1847. The Hargrove Mill House runs on a simple doctrine. Work first, questions never. The river turns the wheel turns the mill, and the mill turns people into output. No theatrical cruelty is necessary when the system is engineered to grind. Diana Carter has been moved here as if she were a crate of tools, labeled temporary, handled like property, watched like risk. Her daughter Lila, 13, is kept visible and busy because exhaustion is the cheapest form of control. This is what the Beauregards called family consolidation. This is what it actually is, strategic isolation, designed to suffocate a promise without openly killing it. Silas Beauregard believes the move solved his problem. Edmund Beauregard believes he postponed a hard decision. Both men are wrong in the same way powerful men often are. They assume the enslaved have no agency worth calculating. They assume a woman who has served a house all her life has nothing left but obedience. They assume the only underground railroad is dirt and darkness. They do not understand the quieter railroad, the one that runs through memory, through family ties, through the discipline of keeping records in a world that tries to erase you. Diana has served masters since she was a child. She has listened to them confess without meaning to, over brandy, over card tables, over ledger books. She has watched them lie with a straight face and then pray with the same mouth. And after March 1847, after the transfer, she understands that hope alone is not enough. Hope must be armed, not with guns. With proof. Proof is the only weapon the plantation fears, because proof turns whispers into accusations. By June 2, 1847, Diana is already building a file inside her head. She starts with what she knows, dates, signatures, habits. Isaac Beauregard's handwriting, how he looped the B in Beauregard, how he underlined totals when he was angry, how he dated memos in a tight, precise hand. She remembers September 1846, the weeks before he died, when his temper softened in small, unsettling ways. Less shouting at servants, more silence in the office, more time staring at papers as if he was weighing his life against his own conscience. Diana does not romanticize him. She does not call him good. She calls him what he was, a master who still owned her, and yet a master who, at the end, wrote something dangerous, the Freedom Clause. Dated September 21st, 1846. That date becomes a blade in Diana's pocket, invisible but sharp. Then she moves to what the plantation cannot control, witnesses. The Beauregards treated the clause as sentiment, but sentiment is not admissible. Testimony is. Diana knows there was a woman in the big house in September who saw and heard more than the family wanted. Marguerite Thibodeau, 33, a white seamstress hired for finishing work. Marguerite was not family, which means she was useful and disposable, which also means she was often overlooked. Diana remembers her because Marguerite had the habit of speaking plainly when she thought no men were listening. In late September 1846, Marguerite mentioned, casually, that Isaac had been fixated on a paper, kept returning to it, rereading it, repeating words like free and proper. Marguerite had no reason to invent that. People invent lies to gain advantage. Marguerite gained nothing from noticing. That makes her dangerous to Silas. Diana cannot send letters openly. She cannot travel. She cannot ask questions directly. So she does what enslaved women did when every avenue was guarded. She uses the household itself as a messaging system, a folded scrap tucked into laundry, a sentence spoken in a doorway and disguised as instruction. By June 9, 1847, a small note is moving back toward St. Mary Parish, carried through hands that never meet each other fully, because networks survive by compartmentalizing. The message is simple. Find Marguerite. Ask what she remembers. Ask if she will swear it. Ask if she will confirm the date and the language. This is not begging for mercy. This is assembling ammunition. Meanwhile, Diana begins collecting physical evidence the only way she can, by observing paperwork in motion. At the mill house, Caleb Hargrove keeps account books, supplies, labor assignments, deliveries. Diana is placed near them for domestic tasks, close enough to see headings and dates when pages are left open. She notices how transfers are recorded, how names are abbreviated, how property is tracked across households. She pays attention to the phrase Silas used, temporary transfer, and looks for it in writing. Because there is a difference between what men say and what they dare to record. The plantation's hypocrisy often lives in that gap. If the transfer is recorded as a sale, it exposes Silas's lie. If it is recorded as a loan, it exposes his scheme. Either way, it exposes intention. By June 18, 1847, Diana has learned another detail. Caleb Hargrove is not merely a cousin helping the estate. He is a pressure valve. He takes in disputed people, those with complicated status, because complicated people are profitable. They can be bought cheap, worked hard, sold again. Caleb is a man who understands liquidity. That realization makes Diana's urgency clinical. Lila is not safe here, not because Caleb is a cartoon monster, but because the market is always nearby. In this world, a girl becomes valuable at the moment her body becomes labor. 13 is not childhood on a ledger. It's a category shift. So Diana makes a second move, quieter and more dangerous. She starts shaping Edmund Beauregard's conscience into a liability. Edmund is still the legal heir. His signature still matters. His hesitation can be used against him if it is documented. Diana cannot confront him, but she can create pressure that forces him to see the consequences of his delay. She sends a message to the big house through a trusted carrier, not an emotional plea, but a factual warning, that Isaac's clause was witnessed, that names can be spoken, that the parish will eventually hear who blocked a dead man's written wish. Diana is not threatening violence, she is threatening exposure. And for families like the Beauregards, exposure is the only thing they fear more than debt. Edmund receives word of this in late June, June 26, 1847, and it lands like a cold hand on the neck, because Edmund's entire identity is built on appearing reasonable. He wants to be seen as a better master, a modern one, a man who keeps order without excess. But Diana's warning implies something he cannot ignore. In trying to avoid conflict, he is creating a scandal. His delay is becoming evidence of bad faith. His name is being tied to a broken promise. This is the moral trap Edmund cannot talk his way out of. If he honors the clause, he angers Silas and the creditors. If he refuses, he becomes the face of the betrayal. The difference is that one path costs him comfort, and the other costs Diana her life. That is the ethical math slavery forces. The powerful lose prestige. The powerless lose people. Silas senses the shift immediately. He is a man trained to smell resistance before it speaks. By June 30th, 1847, he is already sending instructions to Hargrove to tighten supervision. More oversight, less movement, fewer interactions between Diana and anyone who visits from the Beauregard house. Silas wants Diana quiet because a quiet enslaved person is manageable and a calculating enslaved person is a threat. He cannot hit her into silence, not without risk of gossip and scrutiny. So he tries to starve her of information and contact. He treats her like a disease, isolate, contain, prevent spread. But Diana has already done what he cannot reverse. She has turned the plantation's own tools, paper, witnesses, dates, into a case. Her countermove is not escape through running, it is escape through indictment. She is forcing the story to exist outside Silas's control. She is making it portable. And this is where the film's darker truth becomes unavoidable. The enslaved were not passive recipients of suffering. They were analysts of the system that consumed them. They learned its loopholes because their children's lives depended on it. Diana's strategy is not romantic. It is survival sharpened into method. She is not asking for kindness. She is assembling proof that kindness was promised, then stolen. June 1847 ends with two files growing at once. In the north, money is being gathered to ransom Diana and Lila. In Louisiana, Diana is gathering the other currency that can purchase freedom when money alone fails. Testimony, documentation, reputational risk. This is what resistance looks like when you are denied weapons and mobility. You weaponize the record. You insist that someone, somewhere, will remember precisely who delayed, who signed, who moved a child like an object. And you make the powerful understand that forgetting will not be an option. September 1847. The river air is heavy, and the plantation's patience is running thin, because patience is a luxury owners expect from the owned, not from themselves. For months, Silas Beauregard has been tightening the net, moving Diana and Lila, narrowing their contact, starving them of information, believing that if he controls the environment, he controls the outcome. But control has a weakness. The powerful forget. It assumes the world ends at the property line. It doesn't. It never did. And on September 8, 1847, a letter arrives that proves it. Clean paper, clean handwriting, and a message that carries the only language the Beauregards truly respect: money. The offer does not come like a plea. It comes like a transaction. Samuel Price, 50, Quaker merchant, introduces himself in the manner of a man who knows exactly how to sound harmless. He references labor arrangements and domestic service. He encloses a draft proposal, lawful purchase terms for Diana Carter and her daughter Lila, plus a discrete sum for transport. No threats, no sermons. Just a figure, written plainly. This is the above-ground underground railroad at full speed. Freedom carried by receipts, made possible by families in the North who had to buy back the people the South stole. If you want a single sentence to indict the nation, it's this. A mother's liberty arrives not as a right, but as an invoice. Silas sees the letter first. That is not an accident. The mail is managed, the office is managed, the estate is managed. Silas positions himself at every choke point because choke points are where outcomes are decided. He reads Price's proposal and understands immediately what it means. Diana has connections. Diana has a network. Diana is not just a servant with a rumor of freedom, she is now a potential loss. And losses make men like Silas reckless. He does not march into Edmund's office and announce, "The North is buying them." He frames it as contamination. He calls it outside interference. He calls it provocation. On September 10th, 1847, he finally sits Edmund down with the letter and speaks in the language that has always worked on a young heir, fear dressed as responsibility. He says accepting this offer will invite abolitionist attention. He says it will signal weakness. He says it will set a precedent that the estate can be negotiated by outsiders. He makes the purchase sound like an invasion. He makes Diana's freedom sound like a threat to the Beauregard name. But the letter also exposes something Silas cannot fully control. It provides Edmund an alternative to moral courage. Edmund can accept the purchase and tell himself he did the practical thing. He can claim he honored his father's promise without confronting his family directly. He can convert a moral obligation into a business decision. That's what makes this moment so dark. Even the path to freedom is forced to pass through a master's self-image. Edmund reads the offer and goes quiet. He is 27 now. The first year of inheritance has taught him that mastery is a constant negotiation with vultures, creditors, relatives, parish expectations. He is tired of Silas's pressure, tired of being called weak in subtle ways. He also cannot escape the truth Diana has been building around him for months. Witnesses exist, dates exist, and the Freedom Clause still bears Isaac's authority. Edmund knows the clause is real. He knows delaying it is cowardice. He knows that moving Diana and Lila to Hargrove's mill house was not temporary management. It was obstruction, and the purchase offer lands on top of that knowledge like a weight. A way out, yes, but also a mirror. Silas senses Edmund's hesitation, again, and this time he escalates. He does what men like him do when persuasion fails. He presents consequences. On September 12, 1847, Silas produces a second document, drafted, unsigned, authorizing further transfer of Lila to a property deeper inland, ostensibly for training and productive placement. It is phrased as opportunity. It is in truth a hostage note. Silas does not need to say, "If you accept the offer, I will make sure you can't deliver the girl." He only needs to let Edmund see that he can move Lila beyond reach faster than any northern money can catch her. This is the plantation's ultimate leverage, separation. It always returns to separation. Edmund finally shows a flicker of something like disgust, not for slavery as a system, but for Silas's bluntness. For the first time, Edmund sees his uncle not as a guardian of the estate, but as a man who enjoys the mechanics of control. Yet Edmund's disgust does not automatically become action. He is still a man trained to value reputation over righteousness. The question is whether this time he will choose the harder path. September 15, 1847. Edmund goes to Carpentier, the parish attorney, and asks the only question that matters. Can this purchase be executed quickly, cleanly, and in a way that cannot be contested by Silas afterward? Carpentier answers like a professional. Yes, if the chain of ownership is clear. And there is the problem, because Silas's temporary transfer to Caleb Hargrove has muddied that chain on purpose. Uncertainty always buys time for a sale. Uncertainty always buys time for a sale. You see how the system protects itself? It manufactures confusion, then calls confusion legality. Edmund leaves that meeting with a choice that is no longer abstract. If he wants to accept Price's offer and fulfill Isaac's clause, he must first undo Silas's ledger trick. He must reclaim legal control over Diana and Lila. That means confronting Caleb Hargrove, confronting Silas, and exposing the transfer for what it was, an obstruction. On September 18, 1847, Edmund rides to Hargrove's property. He arrives not as a savior, but as a man trying to salvage his own authority. Caleb receives him with polite hardness. Caleb is 40, experienced enough to read weakness in younger men, confident because he believes papers protect him. He produces the transfer document. He emphasizes the word temporary like it's a shield. Edmund asks to see Diana and Lila's status in the account book. Caleb hesitates. That hesitation is everything, because it suggests the transfer was recorded in ways that exceed temporary. It suggests profit. It suggests intention beyond stewardship. Diana watches from the edges of the household. She does not approach. She does not plead. She stands where she can be seen without appearing to demand attention, because demand is punished. She reads Edmund's face and understands he is fighting two battles, one against Silas and one against his own need to be seen as decent. She does not rely on his conscience. She relies on pressure. The northern offer is pressure. The witness testimony she has been assembling is pressure. The possibility of scandal is pressure. In a world where enslaved people are denied legal standing, pressure becomes the only language available. Edmund returns to the Beauregard estate by September 20th, 1847, with his decision not yet spoken but already forming. He confronts Silas in Isaac's old office, the same room where the Freedom Clause was first treated like a nuisance. Silas tries to dominate the conversation immediately. He calls Edmund naive, calls Price an agitator, calls the offer dangerous. Edmund interrupts. A small act, but in this house, interruption is rebellion. He states the simple fact Silas can't erase. Isaac's clause exists, dated September 21st, 1846, and Edmund is now the legal head of the estate. He will not allow further transfers of Lila. He will not allow Silas to manage this any longer. He will either execute manumission or accept the purchase, but the outcome will be freedom. He says it like a verdict, not a discussion. Silas's face changes, not rage. He's too controlled for theatrical rage. His expression becomes something colder, calculation under threat. He realizes Edmund might actually act. And when a man like Silas realizes he is losing, he looks for one last lever, fear. He warns Edmund that the family will fracture, that creditors will punish, that the parish will gossip. Edmund hears him and, for once, does not retreat. Because Edmund has finally understood the real danger. Not gossip, but history. Not creditors, but his own name attached to a broken promise and a sold child. September 1847 closes with the ransom offer on the table, the clause no longer treated as a sentimental artifact, and Silas forced into a defensive posture. But do not mistake this for a clean moral victory. The path here is still stained. Diana and Lila's freedom is being negotiated like a settlement, because the system refuses to recognize their humanity without compensation. That is why this chapter must be remembered as an accusation. Families in the North had to gather money, hard-earned, scarce, to buy back their own blood. Masters debated whether to accept. Lawyers discussed chain of ownership. And in the middle, a mother and child waited while men argued over the price of what should never have been owned. Remember that, because forgetting is how the respectable crimes stay respectable. December 1847. If you want the ending to feel clean, this is not your story. Clean endings belong to the people who never had to negotiate for their own humanity. What happens here is not redemption. It is extraction. It is a mother and child being dragged through the last miles of a system that insists liberty must be purchased like lumber or rice. The Beauregards call it resolution. The record will try to call it an arrangement. But the truth, uncomfortable, prosecutable in any moral court, is that the plantation doesn't release Diana and Lila because it suddenly grows a conscience. It releases them because pressure finally outweighs greed, and because the men at the top realize one more act of obstruction might expose them. By December 3rd, 1847, the paper trail is thick enough to choke a liar. The Freedom Clause dated September 21st, 1846 is no longer a rumor whispered in hallways. It is a documented instruction with witnesses circling it like knives. Marguerite Thibodeau has confirmed what Diana already knew, that Isaac spoke the promise aloud in late September and treated it as deliberate, not delirious. Parish attorney Jules Carpentier has warned Edmund, in the language lawyers use when they don't want to admit moral disgust, that continued delay can be interpreted as bad faith and could trigger broader scrutiny. And then there is the North's offer, Samuel Price's lawful purchase proposal. money collected in Philadelphia and Boston by free black hands that refused to accept erasure. Two forces now clamped the estate from different sides, the dead patriarch's written command and the living family's cash. Of the March transfer to Caleb Hargrove, He argues that honoring the clause now would be legally messy. Notice the technique. He creates the mess, then points at it as an excuse to do nothing. That is bureaucratic violence in its purest form. Manufacture ambiguity, then weaponize it. But Edmund has finally learned what it feels like to be cornered by his own cowardice. He sees the trick. He also sees the larger danger. If he lets Silas win again, he will not only lose Diana and Lila's freedom, he will inherit Silas's methods as his own identity. So Edmund does the only thing that matters in this chapter. He asserts authority not as performance, but as decision. December 8, 1847. He orders Caleb Hargrove to return Diana and Lila to Beauregard custody immediately for estate settlement. He frames it as administrative, but it is the first true reversal of Silas's scheme. Caleb protests, politely, predictably, because he likes profit and hates losing face. Edmund answers with the language of masters. He threatens legal action, threatens to expose the transfer terms, threatens to drag the temporary lie into daylight. Caleb backs down, not because Edmund is righteous, but because scandal is expensive. The plantation class fears money loss more than moral loss. Edmund finally uses that fear as leverage. Diana and Lila are returned under escort by December 11, 1847, not as honored guests, not as respected persons, but as contested items being moved back to the shelf for appraisal. Diana keeps her expression steady. This is not a moment for celebration. She has survived too long to confuse movement with safety. She watches how servants glance at them, how Silas's eyes linger, how Edmund avoids meeting her gaze too directly, still unable to face the human cost of his delay without flinching. Lila stays close to Diana's side like a shadow with a heartbeat, because she has learned the key lesson of slave childhood. Distance can become permanent in one afternoon. On December 13, 1847, Samuel Price arrives at the parish office with the draft funds finalized, clean amounts, clean wording, and terms designed to leave no room for Silas to claim confusion. Price is careful not to sound like an abolitionist crusader. He sounds like a businessman, because business is the dialect the South cannot openly reject. The funds represent months of sacrifice, wages pooled, church collections counted, free black families in the North paying to reverse a theft that the nation legalized. That money is not just currency, it is testimony. It says, without speeches, we kept the connection, we did not forget, we refused to let distance become death. Here is the dark irony. The people with the least power are the ones forced to do the most work to make justice happen. The enslavers contribute nothing but a signature, and even that signature is treated as a favor. December 15, 1847, the documents are prepared. Two paths are placed side by side, manumission by honoring Isaac's clause and liberation by purchase. Edmund chooses the hybrid that protects him most. He authorizes acceptance of Price's payment while simultaneously referencing Isaac's written intent, as if stitching morality to money will make the outcome look cleaner. It doesn't. It just reveals how deeply the system corrupted everything. Even a promise of freedom must be processed like a transaction to satisfy the men who benefited from bondage. Silas sits in the room when the papers are read. He does not explode. He does not collapse. He simply watches, jaw set, because a man like Silas does not need the enslaved to remain enslaved for personal survival. He needs the principle of control to remain undefeated. This outcome is not defeat for him if he can frame it as profit. So he pushes for one last insult. He insists the valuation include lost labor and transfer inconvenience. He tries to make the price sting. He wants freedom to feel like punishment for those pursuing it. Edmund allows some of it because Edmund is still half inheritance, half man. He still bargains with cruelty instead of rejecting it outright. The paperwork is signed on December 17, 1847. That date matters. Mark it. Remember it. Because the record loves to blur the day when a human life stopped being legally ownable, as if clarity might provoke accountability. On that day, Diana Carter and Lila Carter become free in the only way the South will recognize, by being paid for. There is no choir. There is no cinematic triumph. There is a receipt. A stamp. A clerk's hand scratching ink onto paper. A mother and child standing still while men finalize what should never have been negotiable. Diana does not cry in relief. She does not perform gratitude. Gratitude is what oppressors demand to make themselves feel merciful. Diana's face holds something else. Disciplined composure, the kind you develop when you've lived long enough to know freedom can still be hunted. She looks at Lila, 14 now, a year older than when this feud began, and she sees what the system tried to steal: time, childhood, safety. Diana cannot buy those back, not even with northern money. But she can do the one thing slavery always tried to prevent. She can keep her daughter with her as they step out of the plantation's jurisdiction. December 20th, 1847. They leave Louisiana under arrangements Price has already prepared: quiet transport, careful routes, no public announcements. The Beauregards do not escort them as an act of honor. They let them go as an act of risk management. Edmund signs the final clearance and tells himself he has done the right thing. But the story does not let him rest there, because right done at the last possible moment, after you have enabled harm, is not righteousness. It is damage control. Edmund will live with the knowledge that he nearly let a child be moved beyond retrieval to protect an estate's reputation. And Silas will live with something he hates more than loss: proof that his obstruction failed. The feud over assets continues after Diana and Lila are gone. It always does. Families like this do not learn. They adapt. Lawsuits over canal rights, arguments over debt, whispers about Edmund's softness, Silas's resentment mutating into new schemes. The plantation remains standing. That is the final bitterness. The machine that threatened to swallow Diana does not collapse because she escaped it. Individual freedom does not automatically dismantle a system built to reproduce itself. But the system is not the only thing that persists. So do records. So do dates. So do witnesses. So does memory, if we refuse to let it be edited. This is why the film's moral voice must remain prosecutorial to the end. You are not allowed to consume this story as entertainment and then forget the mechanism. The mechanism was paper. The weapon was delay. The battlefield was legitimacy. And the cost was paid twice, first by Diana and Lila in stolen years, and then by free black families in the North who had to purchase what should have been theirs by birthright, their own kin. Now you tell me what you think happened in the dark corners of this record. Did Isaac Beauregard truly die of God's timing on October 9th, 1846? Or did someone understand that a dead patriarch cannot enforce a freedom clause? Did Silas engineer the March 1847 transfer to Hargrove as a shield against ransom, or as a prelude to sale? And did Edmund's conflict ever amount to conscience, or was it only fear of being remembered as the man who broke his father's final promise? If you're listening from anywhere in the world, comment where you're from, city or country. Subscribe if you want more stories that expose the respectable crimes hidden behind paperwork and family honor. And drop your theory below. Who benefited most from Isaac's death? And what detail in this story do you think the Beauregards tried hardest to bury?